In the winter of 1545, in the highlands of central Mexico, a comet appeared in the sky over Tenochtitlan. To the people who saw it, that was the warning. What followed felt like the thing it warned about. Within weeks, people were dying so fast that entire households disappeared in a matter of days. Not from wounds, not from war, from something that started as a headache and ended 3 days later in blood. Aztec physicians, who had treated wounds, set bones, and managed fevers for generations, had never seen anything like it. They gave it a name in Nahuatl, cocoliztli, pestilence. Spanish friars, some of whom had lived through plague in Europe, didn't recognize it either. They called it pujamiento de sangre, the abundance of blood. Two civilizations, two languages, and neither one had a diagnosis. What they had was a death toll that would eventually reach into the millions, and a mystery that wouldn't get a real answer for almost 500 years. To understand why 1545 was so catastrophic, you have to look at the 25 years before it. In 1520, smallpox arrived with the Spanish, and it may have done more to topple the Aztec Empire than Spanish steel did. Some estimates put the death toll from that first epidemic alone at 5 to 8 million people, a huge share of the population gone in months. Then came measles in 1531, then mumps. Every decade or so, a new epidemic swept through, each one with its own Nahuatl name: Huezahuatl, the Great Rash; Tepitonzahuatl, the Small Rash. By the 1540s, indigenous communities had already survived multiple mass death events in a single generation. Then the rain stopped. Centuries later, scientists reading tree rings, which record wet years and dry years the way growth lines on a tooth record a person's life, would discover that the mid-1500s sat inside the most severe sustained drought to hit central Mexico in over 600 years. Crops failed. Grain stores, already strained by Spanish colonial demands for labor and tribute, ran short. Entire communities had been forcibly relocated into denser agricultural settlements, which made food scarcity worse and disease easier to spread. So picture the population cocoliztli was about to hit, repeatedly traumatized by disease, malnourished, crowded, and living through the worst drought in 6 centuries. This wasn't a healthy society meeting a new germ. It was a population with almost nothing left in reserve. The descriptions that survive from 1545 are graphic enough that modern doctors still argue about them. It began abruptly: high fever, dizziness, a headache severe enough that patients couldn't tolerate even a blanket touching their skin. Eyes turned red, pulse grew faint and rapid. Within a day or two, jaundice set in, turning the skin yellow, and patients became disoriented, restless, sometimes delirious. Then came the symptom that terrified everyone watching: hard, painful swellings behind the ears, sometimes growing large enough to spread across the neck and jaw. When they burst, they drained. Ulcers appeared in the mouth and genitals. And then the bleeding started, from the nose, the gums, the ears, and worse. Urine turned dark, almost black, which physicians at the time correctly recognized as a sign the patient was not going to survive. Death came in 3 to 5 days, sometimes less. Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, the Franciscan friar famous for documenting Aztec culture in what became the Florentine Codex, didn't just witness this epidemic. He worked through it, personally treating thousands of patients in Tlatelolco, and eventually caught the disease himself. He survived. Many of the people he treated did not. In the city of Tlaxcala, colonial records describe up to 1,000 deaths a day at the epidemic's worst point. The friar Toribio de Benavente, known as Motolinia, estimated that 60 to 90% of the indigenous people in affected areas died. Indigenous pictorial codices, the Codex Telleriano Remenses and the Codex and Cruz among them, recorded the same catastrophe in images: skin covered in spots, figures shown bleeding from the nose, and a grim note translated simply as "great mortality among the Indians." By the time the outbreak faded around 1548, estimates put the death toll between 5 and 15 million people, as much as 80% of the indigenous population in the regions it hit. For comparison, the Black Death killed roughly half of Europe's population over 4 years. Cocoliztli may have killed a larger share of its population in less time. Here's what made cocoliztli different from every other epidemic that hit the Americas after 1492. Smallpox, measles, mumps, Europeans recognized those. They'd lived through versions of them at home. When those diseases arrived in Mexico, brutal as they were, at least there was a name for what was happening. Cocoliztli matched nothing. Not smallpox, not typhus, the disease most associated with cramped, unsanitary conditions in Europe. Not any fever Spanish physicians had trained to recognize. Francisco Hernandez, a royal physician sent by the Spanish crown to study the natural world of Mexico, examined victims during a later outbreak and still couldn't place it against anything from European medicine. For the next 4.5 centuries, that gap got filled with theories, not evidence. Some blamed indigenous bathing practices, some blamed the climate. Some, including several Spanish clergy at the time, framed it in purely religious terms, punishment for what they saw as idolatry, or from more sympathetic voices, even a mercy that spared indigenous communities further suffering under colonial rule. None of that was medicine. It was people reaching for an explanation with no tools to actually find one. By the 20th century, historians had narrowed the guesses to more scientific candidates: an indigenous hemorrhagic fever, unique to the Americas and never seen by Europeans; typhus spread by lice in crowded, drought-stressed villages; or simple starvation and dehydration, severe enough to produce disease-like symptoms on its own. The problem was proof. Skeletons don't usually preserve evidence of a 3-day fever. Every theory was plausible. None of them could be tested, because for 450 years there was nothing left to test. That changed with the discovery in a town called Tepozcala Yucunda in Oaxaca, a Mixtec community, not Aztec, but one directly tied by historical and archaeological record to the same 1545 epidemic. Archaeologists there found something unusual: a large plaster-covered cemetery, clearly built in a hurry, holding the remains of roughly 800 people. Everything about it, the layout, the speed of construction, the historical records of a nearby town describing 30 to 40 deaths a day, pointed to a mass burial from the epidemic's peak. For most of history, that would have been the end of the trail. Skeletons rarely hold on to evidence of what actually killed someone, but teeth are different. Deep inside a tooth is pulp tissue that was, at the moment of death, full of blood, and whatever pathogens were circulating in that blood. Sealed inside enamel, that DNA can survive for centuries. A team from the Max Planck Institute, working with researchers from Mexico and Harvard, extracted DNA from the teeth of victims at the site. Using a new sequencing method that could screen genetic material against hundreds of known pathogens simultaneously, rather than testing for one suspect at a time, they got a match, and it repeated across multiple individuals: Salmonella enterica, subspecies Paratyphi C, a bacterial cause of enteric fever, closely related to typhoid. It was the first time ancient DNA had successfully identified a candidate pathogen for cocoliztli, after more than a century of speculation. And the fit made sense on more than one level. Enteric fever spreads through contaminated food and water, exactly the conditions you'd expect in a population dealing with drought, food insecurity, and the crowded, disrupted settlements the Spanish had forced them into. A population with no prior exposure to this specific strain would have little to no immunity, which lines up with just how fast and how lethally it spread. For the first time in nearly 500 years, cocoliztli had a physical suspect, not just a description. Here's the part most headlines left out when this study made news. The researchers themselves were careful. They didn't claim to have solved cocoliztli. They said they'd found strong evidence that Salmonella Paratyphi C was present, and that it deserved to be treated as a serious candidate. That's a narrower claim than mystery solved, and it matters. For one, this evidence comes from a single site representing a Mixtec population in Oaxaca, not the Aztec heartland the epidemic is most associated with in popular memory. It tells us this pathogen was circulating in at least one epidemic community. It doesn't prove it was present everywhere cocoliztli struck, or that it alone explains the devastation. There's also a linguistic problem some historians have raised. The word cocoliztli is often translated simply as pestilence, but more precisely, it evokes something closer to pustules or a breaking out of the skin. Enteric fever, historically, doesn't typically produce the dramatic skin symptoms, swollen neck masses, or profuse bleeding described in eyewitness accounts. Those symptoms line up more closely with a hemorrhagic fever than with typhoid's cousin. And then there's the matter of multiple causes at once. Historians studying the 1918 flu pandemic learned that most of its victims didn't die directly from the virus. They died from secondary bacterial pneumonia that set in afterward. Cocoliztli, hitting a population already stretched thin by famine, forced labor, and successive epidemics, may have worked the same way. Several pathogens moving through a collapsing population simultaneously, with salmonella as one contributor among others, not the sole cause. Even the epidemic's return in 1576 adds a strange wrinkle. That second wave killed an estimated 2 million more people, but eyewitnesses at the time noted something odd. Adults in their 40s and 50s, survivors of the first outbreak, seemed to fare better than the young. It was the children and grandchildren of survivors who died in the greatest numbers. Some researchers see that as a sign that surviving 1545 may have built some immunity to whatever came back in 1576, which, if true, would only make sense if the same pathogen or a closely related one caused both. So the honest answer, even today, is this. Cocoliztli was probably not one clean story with one villain. It was a population collapsing under drought, famine, colonization, and disease all at once. And Salmonella paratyphi C is the first piece of that collapse we've actually been able to prove, rather than guess. 500 years ago, the best physicians on either side of the Atlantic watched people bleed to death in days and had no framework for what they were seeing. It took reading DNA out of teeth buried for nearly half a millennium to get even part of the answer, and even now that answer comes with caveats, competing theories, and a research team careful enough to admit what they don't know. Cocoliztli killed a larger share of its population than the Black Death did in Europe. It reshaped an entire continent's demographic future, and for most of the last 500 years, it barely registered outside the region it devastated. That's the pattern behind a lot of history's worst catastrophes. The loudest disasters get remembered. The ones that are still being pieced together, tooth by tooth, get forgotten until someone finally asks the right question.